Hello, and welcome to the CSJ's Beyond Westminster podcast, where we bring you real stories from across Britain's forgotten communities. Today we're discussing the alarming rise of violent crime across the capital. Our latest research has found that knife crime offences in London have risen every year since the pandemic, and nearly 1 in 4 London residents say they have been threatened or attacked by someone in the city in the last 5 years. As a result, 63% of Londoners now say they support the controversial stop-and-search measures used by the police to curb violent crime. Joining us today to discuss this is Nikita Malik, author of the CSJ's latest report called Serious Violence in London, and Lord Bailey of Paddington, former special advisor to David Cameron on youth and crime and former London mayoral candidate. On the podcast, we'll hear insights from Lord Bailey into the challenges faced by the capital's policymakers in delivering London's crime prevention strategies, the implications of skyrocketing crime for the upcoming mayoral election, and his views on how we can tackle serious violent crime. So on today's episode, we invite you to go beyond the sensational headlines, beyond the surface of the stories, and beyond Westminster.
Good morning. This podcast will cover our report, Serious Violence in London, launched by the Centre for Social Justice last Monday. Interesting findings from our research included the fact that nearly 1 in 4 Londoners, 22%, had been attacked or threatened by violence in the last 5 years, and that the majority of Londoners across ethnic groups and ages tended to support the use of stop and search by the police. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Lord Bailey. Lord Bailey, statistics show that the number of police officers in the London Met Police and the City of London Police are higher in 2023 than they were in previous years. Yet, knife crime offences after the pandemic continue to rise. What do you think is going wrong? Let's jump right into it.
Good morning and thank you for having me. Look, the number of police in the context of how you feel about crime is largely irrelevant, because unless we have a copper each stood next to us, how we feel about crime is about perception, which is driven around the stories people tell, what's going on in the media, and the reality of, have you ever met anybody who's been a victim of crime? I happen to come from a very poor community, so and with high levels of crime, the two things are not always related. I don't want to relate the two things, but I came from a community with high levels of crime. So therefore, we often spoke about crime because it was a real reality for us. Most Londoners actually wasn't that way. But recently it's become that way, mostly because of the incidents of antisocial behaviour and robbery. Now, antisocial behaviour often for people doesn't feel like a crime. Robbery always does. It's actually a very terrifying crime. And when I say robbery, I include knife crime, etc. in that street-based crime. Many, many more people have become a victim of that, hear a story about it, or have physically seen it. And that's why there's a high perception of it. The other piece I would say as well is it's perceived that the police cannot and will not do anything about it, and that's where the real problem lay.
I think that's fascinating, and actually this is something we really struggled to come to terms with when we were doing our data and polling both in London and nationally, that crime was seen as the number one problem that people faced across the nation. But the data is not always, as you said, reflective of the levels of crime, because people might not be reporting that crime, or they don't trust the police or the judges. So actually the scale of the problem could be a lot larger than the statistics that we see. Yet that's the kind of thing that the Mayor of London candidates, particularly Sadiq Khan, will use the statistics to show that they're actually doing a good job in tackling crime. So we know that you ran for a London mayor in the last election. Do you think that the current candidate, Sadiq Khan, has done a good job of tackling crime, because he claims that knife crime offences have gone down in the last 5 years?
He simply has not, and it's statistically a fact he has not, and the feeling definitely not. You're talking about a mayor who has consistently not backed the police, and the real perception around crime is that the police cannot do anything. We are in a situation now where the police's authority has been trashed, And the persons most responsible for trashing authority are unfortunately politicians led by Sadiq Khan. That's why we're in this problem. And that's why you have many communities who now reject the police who wouldn't. And you have many communities who attack the police who normally wouldn't. They'd have been indifferent to the existence of the police. They now attack the police for different reasons. And that charge has been led by the mayor. The case of Sarah Everard, a disgusting case where a serving Metropolitan Police officer did the most vile things, was a real low point for the police, and I think it was lowered even more by the mayor's response. Many people made it sound like all police officers were that way. That was one, and there's certainly more terribly behaved police officers. But when you liken the police to one bad behavior, when you remove their the respect that we have for the police, everybody then is at a heightened sense of danger. And we all instinctively know this. And that's why we all now feel crime is worse than it's ever been, because the people between us and crime, we have less respect for. So we believe we are much more likely to come into contact with crime.
And actually, our polling through London showed that people wanted the police to be more involved. They wanted police to, particularly the ones that had been threatened and attacked by violence in the last 5 years, wanted to see more community policing. They wanted to see police on the streets. They wanted police in secondary schools to use, preventative techniques. They wanted police involved in sports and community events. Yet we simply don't see this happening, even though the numbers might be increasing. People want these things, and that's not actually happening. So do you think the next candidate for the mayor, or even on a wider national level, the government should be putting more initiatives like this in place to connect people with the police and build the trust in the police?
Let's be very clear. The numbers of police officers available for operational policing makes a difference.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem we're talking about is perception. So it's actually beyond the number. If you trebled the number of police officers tomorrow, it would still take time for that perception of danger to go. And the thing that would drive that change would actually be the actions the police take. And currently, there's a feeling that the police are afraid of their own shadow because they're berated for everything they do. If they do stop and search, apparently they're wrong and they're racist and they're doing it in the wrong way. If they can't police demonstrations, they can't police anything as far as the rhetoric around the police goes, and that's where the problem lays. So yes, the number is important, but in addition to that, we have to change what we ask the police to do. So, for instance, the police spend an awful lot of time chasing perceived hate crimes, and actually they should be chasing real criminals up and down the street. The other additional piece, of course, which the police are not responsible for but reap the whirlwind on, is the legal system. There's a huge backlog of people who've committed crimes of varying levels that are yet to go to court, may never go to court. And if you're a criminal, if you're any kind of active criminal, when you see people as you perceive it to be getting away because they haven't been in court, they haven't been sanctioned, then that drives crime like nothing else. And that's the additional problem as well. Because I sometimes feel bad for the police because they're having to carry the burden of their own job, but also the burden of other parts of society, in this case, the legal system, that are not performing. And it looks like the police are not performing because of that.
I just want to talk a little bit more about preventative techniques and what you were speaking about with stop and search, and how that's been painted with a broad brush, particularly by lobby groups and in the past by Khan as well, as being institutionally racist or disproportionately racist. Yet our polling shows that groups across London, regardless of their ethnic background, are supportive of stop and search if they feel that would stop crime. So what do you think is going on here with kind of the larger perception of stop and search versus the very vocal voices of particular lobby groups and individuals against stop and search?
I'll start my response to the question of stop and search with two stories. When Sadiq Khan became mayor, or when he was campaigning to become mayor the first time, he trumpeted long and hard how he would stop and search, he'd reduce it, he didn't like it, he think it's wrong, it's institutionally racist. But under Sadiq Khan, that happened. The police backed away from stop and search because he told them to. He made it quite clear he wouldn't support them in it. And he definitely elevated the voices that were against it. But what we saw under Sadiq Khan is 2 record years for knife crime. And I mean murders, homicide, two in a row under the mayor. And there is a link there. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I say is a much more personal thing. I met a mother and a father, parents, whose son had been murdered, a young black man. And his mother said to me, she wishes that the boy who murdered her boy had been stopped and searched, not only for her own boy's good, but for his good as well, because his life is now over as well, because the police did catch and prosecute him. And that's the issue, isn't it? When these lobby groups have spoken about stop and search, what they've done is spoken about the really horrific time that black communities have had in London with being over policed. And it's all coalesced around this one tactic, which I've been stopped and searched hundreds of times. I was born and raised in London. It can often be very unpleasant, but it's all coalesced around that. And it's built a narrative around stop and search that is wrong, it's negative. And then people went on to use technical terms to say, well, look how many arrests it generates, etc., etc. It's not very high. There's two things they missed. Firstly, stop and search isn't only about arrest, it's about police presence. It's about letting people know that you could potentially get stopped and searched if you had a weapon. So I spoke to a young boy in Croydon who'd never had any involvement in crime at all. He was found with a knife outside his school. When I asked him why he had the knife, he said, well, I feel unsafe because it's all people ever talk about, everybody else having a knife. Plus, I didn't think anybody was going to find it. And that's the key, isn't it? The idea that nobody was going to find it, he felt safe or that he could carry it. And that's a problem. Stop and search generates a feeling amongst criminals about what can and can't be done. And the real shame here is that the public understand that and politicians don't. Primarily the mayor. That's a real problem. And when we talk about disproportionality, and yes, the black community has suffered in the past from large amounts of over policing and disproportionality, I would say the focus of my disproportionality was how many young black people are murdered. We are the single most murdered group in all of Europe. The disproportionality I see is black children, primarily boys, dying through knife crime. That's the disproportion I wanted to concentrate on, because being stopped and searched, we can improve it. It's getting better all the time. I'm not suggesting it's perfect, but it's certainly better. But let's be very, very, very clear. Being stopped and searched is never as unpleasant as being murdered. And for young black men, that's a real thing. We are being murdered.
I think that's fascinating, both your personal stories and the experiences of people that you've met. What do you think, in your opinion, is one technique or one thing that the police should be doing that they're not doing more of? Is it stop and search, or is it something else that you've found from your interviews and your interactions with people in London?
I've been involved in community work and youth work for over 35 years now. And the one thing I know, there is no silver bullet to solving crime. I really wish there was. There isn't. But there's a plethora of things that we could do more of. The first thing I'd say is we need to take so-called low-level antisocial behavior more seriously, because there's an escalation there. We need to do what the former policing minister Kit Malthouse talked about as interfering in the business model of crime. Organized crime is a business, and if you interfere in the business model, that makes a real difference. I would also tag children more, and I use the word children because a lot of children in London are trafficked into crime, but crime needs privacy. And if you know where those children are, it's far harder for organized crime gangs to use them. And also a smart tag isn't an infringement on their liberty so much. They can still go to school, still find a job if they're that age, etc., etc. You just happen to know where they are for that period that they're under license, which I think is important, because when a gang can use these young people in privacy, in private, in secret, that's when the real wickedness happens. And when it comes to stop and search, I would have just kept it at the levels as it was. I'd have always improved the training around it. I'd have always made police officers understand the communities that they're in, but I wouldn't have talked it down, because in the talking down of stop and search, we've talked up the prevalence of weapons on our streets. The other thing I would do as well is do a lot more about removing weapons from the streets. Anything from bins to hand those weapons in, knife sweeps, education, inappropriate youth settings, all manner of things to get weapons off our streets, because ultimately having the weapon is what leads to the death. And the last thing I'd say, the Metropolitan Police have often posted pictures on their social media of the weapons that they've found, really big zombie knives, horrible looking flick knives, etc. I wouldn't do that, because what that has done is greatly added to the arms race. Because if you're a young kid, a teenager, and you think, well, hold on a second, they've got a zombie knife, what do? You go and get your own. And I think it's very helpful that the police have done that. I do acknowledge, I think in recent times, they've started to slow that down. They may have even stopped at this point, but they did it for years, and that wasn't helpful.
And I think my last question is really, what's coming next. So what do you think the one big challenge the next London mayor will face in terms of the area of combating serious violence and crime?
Serious violence and crime is always about involving communities. There's two things about it. So the pleasant end of that is people very rarely attack a community that they feel part of. So are you a Londoner? Are you a South Londoner? Are you part of your little local street, your local youth club, your school? If you have some kind of connection, if you know the people around, if you feel familiar, that your aggravation and or fear is lower, and these things happen less. So to boost that is important, and that's incumbent on all of us. One of the things that really infuriates me when we speak about young people is that we speak about them in the absence of their parents. If you really want to solve something for young people, parents have to be part of that conversation regularly. We are very paternalistic society. The middle classes love to parachute professionals into poor communities and take over, not realizing that community doesn't retain any of their skills they're supposedly being given. We must have parents more involved in the development of any community and in supporting their own children. I would like to see things around mental health as well. If we could teach the vast majority of people very low level mental health triage skills, and in fact, let me remove the word mental health and replace it with mental resilience. If we could help people maintain their mental health, that would be better, because a lot of young children in London, and by young I mean anybody under the age of 21 really, are facing some serious challenges maybe people of my generation didn't quite face, i.e. social media. I think social media creates a very particular, very perverse atmosphere that young people have to traverse. And I think in order to support them in that, we need to help them feel more confident and support their mental health. That will be very important. But when it comes to crime, the first big step is to reinstate the authority of the police. And in order to do that, the police have to become far more trustworthy. I talked about the Sarah Everard case beforehand. That was devastating to the women of London. That lack of trust, that feeling of a lack of trust is real, and the police have to work to put that correct. The other thing is we have to allow the police to do their job and stop treating them like social workers. They are a police service who are meant to have some authority in order to be able to arrest and move people on. And also we have to remove the idea that everybody is a victim and everybody can do as they please, because that damages the wider good for us all. If you see what's going on with protests, if you see what's going on with robbery, if you see what's going on with behaviour on the bus with children and all those things, it's a great feeling that London is slightly lawless. People can do as they please. And I think we do need a more cordial public environment so people feel safe.
Thank you so much. That's been a fascinating insight into your thoughts, and linking that back to our work and our findings in the Serious Violence in London report as well. Thank you so much for your time.
The one thing I'd say to finish though is I still think crime is one of London's biggest problems, but I also think it is solvable. What will help us get past this low moment is not to panic. It's to believe in inherent goodness of people and promote that, elevate that, and not just recede into our own bunkers and batten down hatches and treat everybody like a criminal. We can return to London being a pleasant place to live.
Thank you so much.
If you'd like to hear more, subscribe to our channel for more interesting content like this, and follow us on Twitter @CSJ Think Tank for more updates.